Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of our WE3Live series. Today, we're talking about e-mobility economy and the expanding utility role in it. And we've got a classic Z-Prime guest, good friend of ours, Carl Popham, manager of EVs and emerging technologies at Austin Energy. So to kick off this conversation, I'm going to pass it over to moderator and Z-Prime superstar Laurel Morris. Go ahead, Laurel.
Thank you, Dylan, and welcome everyone to today's WE3Live with Carl. In true Z-Prime fashion, we're starting with a fun speed round and starting with the question for you, Carl. What vehicle do you drive?
First, I love being introduced as a classic Z-Prime guest and friend of the show. So I am happy to be here. But yes, in rapid fire round, during the pandemic, I got rid of my car. I have a lovely electric bike that gets me around.
Wow, an e-bike? That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a pedal assist up to 20 miles per hour on full throttle, 27 miles per hour on pedal assist. Austin has very good bikeways. It is really a great way to get around town. Highly encouraged.
I agree. I just test drove my first e-bike this last weekend because I'll go into a quick story because my bicycle was stolen a month ago and I contacted my home insurance and they said I don't have a deductible at all. They gave me $850. So I was considering like, that's you can buy an e-bike with that. So, and then I found out that Austin Energy provides incredible rebates for e-bikes. I think you give between $100 and $300 for anyone who buys an e-bike. So
correct, up to $300. And then if you're a fleet wanting to electrify an electric bike fleet, it goes up to $400 per e-bike. And it's on a personal note, it's the most heartwarming program my team manages. It's also probably the smallest. We get so many handwritten notes and thank you of people who go electric and how it just transformed their lives and they get to know their neighbors more and everyone's jealous of my bike. And it brings a whole herd of people in who maybe thought biking wasn't for them anymore, or maybe one hill was a barrier to being a commuter. And this has just kind of changed their lives. So the amount of just notes and positive feedback I get on our e-bike rebate program that come through the team is wonderful.
That is so heartwarming. What's something you believe that other people may think is crazy?
A lot. For kind of the purpose of this topic is I think how rapid autonomous vehicle technology is going to change the transportation sector. We are in the edge. And I think just the amount of growth, it's going to be a real domino effect that is just going to really explode on the scene.
Mm-hmm. I hope to see that really soon. What would you put on a billboard, either a phrase, word, or image for 7 billion people across the world to see?
Well, I would say an image, because an image is, a picture speaks 1,000 words, and billboards are generally, you're going to have 3 seconds of passing. We did a billboard as part of our early launch campaign 10 years ago. The electric city is here, and that's also how you spell electricity is here, but with fonts it kind of looked like electric city, and that was it. We had that, some imagery, and then a small URL, pluginaustin.com, which is our vanity URL. Nothing else, not telling you what it was or the product or overcomplicated, because at the end of the day it was a strategy, a campaign around an idea, and nothing expresses ideas better than stories. And nothing is quicker than expressing a story than an image.
That was impeccable, electric city. I love how simple and enticing it is. What's the most interesting technology that you've seen in the last year?
Well, I think from the pre-show, I might have tipped my hand is, your producer, co-creator Dylan has a robot cat litter box in his recording room.
He does.
And so maybe that's top of mind, but you're being a former cat owner, what a great, more positive experience of being a cat owner is having what I'm calling the cat litter box robot because we defined it as a robot because it has a sensor and then a mechanical reaction to the sensor of the cat. So that's the most impressive thing I've seen in a while. If I were to think a little bit longer, especially in the context of electric vehicles, emerging technologies, there's been some very impressive things. That probably the most impressive vehicle I'm interested in is the Ford F-150 Lightning. That has a lot of interesting, both as a generator, a home generator, a work generator, just how they know their market. I haven't seen a product I've been that excited about. You could use the generator capacities of that Ford F-150 Lightning. Yeah, no, sure, why not? Let's do it. That sounds like a good pairing. Although I'm kind of happy with no car right now. I'm not in a hurry. Everything from campaign slogans and building back better, or just how people are thinking, or any focus group on an insistence now. I think the genie's out of the bottle on. So for me, working from home pretty exclusively since the pandemic broke out here at the City of Austin Energy, it helped me rethink my own transportation, and an e-bike is fine. Thank you. Here's a word from our sponsors, and we roll a StEVie, the EV loving T-Rex video. And no, that's not. I guess I should read the production notes prior to hopping on the call, huh?
So with e-mobilities and utilities, what are some of the key current events that you've been seeing, and all of us have? What are some of the key current events in energy that you see as important to e-mobility and utilities?
So in the news, one is there's a lot of interesting news coming out of the federal government, whether the Biden administration's goal of 50% electric vehicle sales by 2030, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has $7.5 billion in EV infrastructure, another $7.5 billion in clean transit. So you're starting to see a clear alignment with a federal strategy with a lot of what cities and utilities across the nation, to include Austin Energy, we're doing. So that's interesting. You're also seeing a lot of huge announcements from big manufacturers shifting from their traditional internal combustion model to a future of EVs. So General Motors, their announcement to be exclusively an electric vehicle company by 2035. Also interesting to note and very telling is the GM stock price jumped up a little over 7% the day they announced that. So you're also having in an investor community, very important, who sees, yes, this is a future for EVs. I would say another one in the news is around the affordability of maintaining EVs. So just probably a week or so ago, the U.S. Department of Energy National Lab, Argonne National Lab, released a very in-depth study on the total cost of ownership, the maintenance of all types of vehicles, to include EVs. And the cliff notes is an EV is 40% less to maintain than its equivalent internal combustion engine. That is also, we're seeing a rise of interest in used cars. So the three fastest selling used cars in the US from a recent report from Inside EVs, 3 out of 3 were EVs. So there's a very hot market in general in the used car market, but the hottest of the hot as far as selling the fastest is EVs. So that's very exciting. They're low cost to maintain, they last longer, and there's of interest to the consumers. And I would say kind of my last in the news kind of thing is around global supply chain and how that's impacting car manufacturers. So Toyota just this morning announced they're going to cut production by 40% due to the chip shortage. And so you have these 99-cent chips that are cutting production around the world. But of interest, you're also seeing some real bipartisan support here in the US to address that. So you're having the Biden administration stating they're seeking $37 billion specifically around chip manufacturing in the US. The Senate did pass a bipartisan technology and manufacturing bill, $250 billion, to address these kind of disparities between the US and China. So there's a lot of support. And I'll kind of end on just more of a spicy tweet by our friend Elon Musk, kind of related to this, but I have this tweet up here on my screen here, so I'll quote specifically. So this was tweeted in March. Tesla and Ford are the only American car makers not to have gone bankrupt out of the thousands of car startups. Prototypes are easy, production is hard, and being cash flow positive is excruciating. And I think there's just a real acknowledgement, especially on car manufacturing, of what a global enterprise it is and how complex it is and how connected we are to other economies and each other globally. Uh, the Ford CEO, he did retweet that because he was the company that Tesla and Ford are the only American not to have gone bankrupt, and his retweet was respect. So those are just kind of some fun things in the news I'm following on the EV front.
Excellent. And we'll definitely celebrate, hopefully, when the infrastructure bill, including some of those things, gets passed in the House soon. And another cause for celebration is that you and your EV and emerging technologies team just celebrated your 10-year anniversary. So you founded this team 10 years ago. How have you seen the utilities' role in mobility change over this time?
Well, huge, yeah. So just a shout out to the team that I've worked with. So I did have the opportunity to co-found the team and lead it in the 10 years. And I would say the first major difference, 10 years ago, people thought I was crazy. Coming from a very kind of secure ecosystem of IT to include being the interim chief information officer, that seemed like the correct pathway to really be ingrained into, a stable job, if you will. And why are you even thinking about going over to this EV and emerging technologies group that's being formed? And I couldn't have been happier. It's one of the best business decisions I've ever made, because just how fun and interesting it has been and how much I learn on a daily basis. So the main thing I've seen is 10 years ago, it was, why are you doing this? And this isn't going to happen. And they slowly evolved is what we think. And now the conversation is no longer about if transportation electrification is going to happen, if EVs are going to happen. It's about how quickly and what can utilities do to basically maximize the opportunities and mitigate the risks of an electric future in the transportation sector, which just as an economy, as an energy economy, has the potential to double the revenues and the amount of service provided by electric utilities as it transitions to all electric. So it is huge. The biggest new load, so, it's been said since the invention of air conditioning, you could even argue looking at it even bigger than that. So the biggest new load in the electric industry ever is the electrification of transportation. So that's probably the biggest change. And then just so also seeing now the new products coming in line, the more people involved in it has changed, the more stakeholders, people who might not traditionally be utility, friends of the show or key stakeholders are now heavily engaged. So whether us working closely with auto dealerships as a key stakeholder of working with them on customer experience, with housing authorities and low-income housing on electrification for their residents and citizens, to just really across the board of different players and stakeholders you work with that have a different viewpoint and a different strength they can bring to the table on an electric sustainable future.
It's amazing to see how fast things have shifted towards that perspective.
Well, frankly, it reminds me, just to reminiscent, that the last time I saw something that impressed me that much, which I went all in on, was a previous one. So I used to be in the military as captain of the military. And when the internet first came out, the military was a very first user of it. And it was people older than you could remember things like Telnet and just how the internet worked. It was kind of clunky and it was just very slow and clunky. But then we had a demonstration of when Port 80 was released. So Port 80 is what allows the World Wide Web to happen. And I saw Port 80, and that's when I realized e-commerce and that's going to change the world. So then I got all in on e-commerce and ended up managing e-commerce practice for one of the 5 largest technology companies in the world. So, really went all in on e-commerce because I just knew. So got to work with a lot of Fortune 100 companies in bringing e-commerce to their platforms because I just knew how big it was. And the EVs kind of has that same vibe as how e-commerce did when I first saw Port 80. When I first started hearing customers talk about their Tesla and the excitement and seeing the some of the early Teslas, that's when I knew this is huge.
Wow. I love that comparison of e-commerce to fleet electrification. I'm curious, what do you see as the future of the next generation in transit, and what's the role of the electric utility?
Well, I think with next generation, I think we as utilities need to really looking about fleets and mobility as a service. We need to really look at where transit is going into the future. You know, so a lot of times what we like to do is we look at, well, how do we switch today? So how do we take an internal combustion engine and turn it to an EV, but not really think about the larger business model? And I think, so I kind of alluded to earlier, autonomous vehicles. And then, you know, it was one thing we did in Austin is it hasn't been finalized up for final comments, is to have a goal of VMT, vehicle miles traveled, 40% of all VMT in Austin by 20% by 2030 to be on the electric platform. So 40% by 2030, we're probably 1% now. The reason why we did VMT and not EVs is it looks at the current and future use cases, and it also helps you focus on high VMT applications. For example, a typical driver on internal combustion engine today in Texas is around 12 to 14,000 miles a year. An electrified gig economy driver will be about 60,000 miles. A shared electric autonomous vehicle, autonomous basically gig economy driver could be 100, 110,000 miles. So one is we wanted to focus our resources on the highest mileage applications because those directly relate to climate and other things you're trying to address. We also think it's just kind of the future of mobility. We're working with Cap Metro on electrifying that's our local transit authority here in Austin. There are 12 electric buses and growing, and they have made a claim they will never buy a fossil fuel bus again. So as every bus retires out, they're being replaced with a combination of depot charge electric buses, as well as a goal to have 65 en route electric bus charges in the network. So as a utility, how can we accommodate these electric depots? So we already helped design and build out an electric depot in North Austin, which is open today and servicing these electric buses. But now phase 2 is how can we do some very high level state of charge en route charging for circular buses that won't be coming back to the depot. And so I think it's really about, you know, as an electric utility person, I would say your first objective is try to become an expert or learn as much as you can about transportation and the trends in transportation. And then how can electrification help that? Oh, that's great. Well, good comment. You were on mute, but I was just nodding my head politely.
So you mentioned a few of your initiatives that you're working on at Austin Energy, and before this session, you sent me over a list of about 26, and it was beautiful, and I was very impressed. How do you go about categorizing and prioritizing your initiatives around electrification as a utility?
Yeah, I mean, that's good. And one is, I think you're the first person I've heard who called an Excel spreadsheet beautiful. So I think you earn your tagline of energy nerd. I think that is your title on LinkedIn, if I recall correctly. And anyone who calls an Excel spreadsheet beautiful properly deserves it. So one is, here's the strategy. The strategy is to have a comprehensive program and not get paralysis by analysis, as I see is one of the number one barrier for utilities getting into this space. So we have a strategy of 5 pillars. So it's more of about balancing a portfolio based on the 5 pillars. And the 5 pillars are is EV infrastructure. You know, a lot of utilities can understand and get behind, you know, public EV charging. We have now about 1,200 public EV charging ports. The second pillar is about affordability and equity. The third pillar is fleets and new mobility. We talked a little bit about fleets, both the Cap Metro, and we're in the process of electrifying our own fleet here in the city of Austin. Pillar number 4 is outreach and education. So everything about the EV's buyer's guide, pluginaustin.com, ev.austinenergy.com, EVs for Schools campaign. There's a lot of different segments you can do in your education and outreach, especially with a focus on being inclusive and engaging to everyone. And then the 5th is grid integration. So we have everything from managed charge pilots like EV360. We have Austin Shines, which has vehicle to grid as part of a larger ecosystem of mostly stationary storage and PV solar. We are in the process of updating our distributed energy resource roadmap and more. So those are the 5 pillars. So it is about having a strategy of a balanced portfolio and hitting all 5 pillars and not putting too much weight in just one and ignoring the other 4, then having this list of 1 to 25, priority list. It is about do something, have a wide enough portfolio, and you will start seeing winners emerge. And what I call winners is a product or program that's starting to get a lot of momentum out of your portfolio. And so then you capitalize on that and push forward the momentum of that one that's coming. And rather than put all your eggs in this number 1 basket, it's a balanced portfolio, and then you identify the momentum winners and then you push those.
That's a great strategy. You mentioned equity and affordability. How can utilities roll out programs that address equity, affordability, and inclusion? What would you recommend?
Well, one thing we did a little over 4 years ago, we won a grant through the 11th Hour Project, a philanthropic project. Mm-hmm. And what we wanted to use the grant funds was to hire a dedicated person in equity and inclusion and create and launch formally a program called EVs are for Everyone. And that person, even though the grant was for 1 year, that person has now been with us for the 4+ years, probably going on 5 year, is now a full-time city employee and is just embedded. So here's what. So one is hire the right person to do it. So we hired someone from their previous role was 12 years on the largest nonprofit in Austin, Meals and Wheels and More. So literally bringing food to people of need. So we needed someone who understood the community and the stakeholders to come to the utility. Even though they never worked for a utility or the city, we can teach them all that stuff. We wanted their knowledge of the demographic we're looking to serve for that. So one, hire correctly and hire a dedicated person. So what we do is we have dedicated programs around that, but we also then have someone who's consistently at the table influencing all our programs with that mindset. So what about this? Or if we're, for example, an electric bike multifamily infrastructure project, if I have that, it's like, well, I have the contacts of places with a lot of affordable housing. Let's try to find the partner there, in which we do. So we're launching this electric bike multifamily infrastructure project with a large population of affordable housing. So you just have those ready to go contacts, whether it's with the housing authority or LMI communities or other stakeholders, to always try first. So even when we launched EVs for Schools, which was launched part of our equity program, the first 4 schools that we launched at, which it's now in over 100 schools, we're all low-income Title I schools. So in Aikens, where we launched it, 80% of those kids are from low-income families. So as a way to just prioritize wherever possible inclusion. Electric bikes are great outreach events. We do a lot of them back when we used to do events in East Austin. And part of the issue, the barrier people saw, is they would see bike lanes coming into their neighborhood and think that wasn't for them. By having safety training, how electric bike works, you get a free helmet, and they realize, yeah, I don't need a car. We literally had moments where people said, I thought I need a car. I didn't know you could put luggage racks on these bikes. This is now, and I have a new bike lane. Now that's for me. I can go to the grocery store and do what I need. And just changing hearts and minds and getting, being proactive in your community.
Exactly. I love how you mentioned the importance of hiring a specific person to be responsible for electrification and equity. And I'd love to commend your team and Austin Energy for creating your team and so many people who are dedicated and accountable for the goals and programs that you're setting. When we spoke to Carter Prescott, who's the director of electrification, you may know, at Southern California Edison, a utility in California, he said that he recommends utilities create a team who's accountable and responsible for these programs and your initiatives. Because if you just assign it to a team that's doing other things right now, then they may not put it on the forefront. So
yeah, I think it's been a real part of the EV success roadmap at Austin Energy, having that dedicated team and having it for quite a while now. I mean, 10 years being in the EV specific business for utility is quite a long time. And then within the team, who you hire and bring on, every member of the Austin Energy Electric Vehicles team is a leader in their own field. So I'm just talking about their efforts. You know, when I shared that beautiful list of the 26 initiatives, I don't lead a single one of those. All 26 of those have a lead and a lot of times a co-lead of members of my team who are passionate about that program and are the CEOs of that project or program or initiative. I just get to aggregate all that information as a portfolio and then share that with you and others internally and externally. But yeah, I personally don't lead any of them. The team does it.
So you've created so much momentum for the utilities that are listening to this and are just beginning to create their own momentum around EV programs. Where do you recommend they start? What should they think about and do first?
I always recommend, a lot of times starting is minimal budget. You're just starting to put your toe in the water. I always recommend the outreach and engagement perspective. Having a strategy, a public facing strategy of what your outcome is, what your thought leadership is, getting people engaged and interested. I mean, one, that just kind of helps start the momentum, but two, it also shows some thought leadership from the utility, because whether you like it or not, you're having a lot of people talking about your business model. And so the adage is, you know, when there's big discussions that could be impacting you and utility, you're either at the table or on the table. And if you're not demonstrating leadership, you're going to be on the table, and now you're going to be reacting to potential unintended consequences than if you were there and able to have your voice heard as being, you know, at the table. So that kind of helps position and brand you and you utility, frankly, to being a leader and interested. And so you're part of those conversations as real life policy, real life laws, real life regulation is being made that's going to highly impact you.
Great. And another question we wanted to touch on was, how do you communicate the benefits of these new electric mobility projects to community residents?
Well, so it depends. The very first question I ask, if someone asks me to come speak or we're planning speaking, is, well, who's the audience? What are their motivations? What does success look for them in their business or their goals? So it's about catering, because there's a lot of different focus points. If I'm talking to a climate leadership team, I'll focus on the CO2 emission reductions and the NOx emissions reductions from not having tailpipes, and really focus on that. And then the scalability as well as the affordability of this transition. If I'm talking to auto dealerships and how, for example, the buyer's guide, please check out ev.austinenergy.com. And if you want to bring a buyer's guide to your own community, we'd be happy to share with you how to set that up. Reach out to me. I talk about how this buyer's guide can sell units, how many units you can expect to sell. So it's really about their motivation as sales managers and sales staff is selling vehicles, and then other programs. So we can, in addition to selling units, by having a strong buyer's guide up front, the buyer can, instead of spending on average an hour and 45 minutes, that's the sales cycle for an EV, and a gas car is 40 minutes. We want to take the hour and 40-minute experience with real-time inventory and bring it down to maybe 10 minutes, you know, to beat the ICE vehicle, where now they have an experience not unlike Tesla, where you do everything online, you have all the information. So you're almost just kind of picking up. So that is a really good turnover from a sales staff. They're not locking up 2 hours basically with no better way to sell. So it depends who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to LMI community apartment managers, well, if I'm talking to multifamily apartment managers, it depends on the apartment manager. If it's a typical, moderate income apart, it's about an amenity. And here's how an amenity, attractive amenity, EV charging. We have stats that most people look at it is in the top 5 amenities of EV charging. So it's a competitive advantage to bring residents into your property. With LMI or like Foundation Community Haka, it's about enabling transformative technologies for new job opportunities or reliable transportation for your residents. And then maybe working with other organizations that can help bring not only infrastructure, but those actual vehicles. So long answer, but know the success objectives of your audience. And the beautiful thing about transportation and the electrification of transportation, there's so many different business cases and outcomes and metrics for a wide variety of demographics and audiences. You can typically bring something pretty strong and compelling to the table.
So call to action, if your utility, definitely reach out to Carl if you'd like help creating your own buyer's guide and for more advice on the initiatives they're pursuing right now. And we seem to always go over our time when we chat because there's so many exciting things to talk about. There's a trend there. And Carl, do you have any final cards or parting remarks you'd like to share?
We're over time. Thank you. I'm just going to leave you with ev.austinenergy.com to check out the buyer's guide. And if you want to bring it to your community, if you want to look at all our programs, pluginaustin.com to include EVs for schools. That one is shovel ready to launch in your community with very low to no budget. So if you're interested in bringing sustainable education from grades 4 through 12 into your schools, that is a fastly going program that's now being captured nationally. We started off here in Austin. We'd be happy to help you launch that in your community as well.
Thank you, Carl, and everyone who's joined us live today. Our special guest next Thursday is going to be Lorraine Akiba from Hawaii. She's a venture capitalist who Carl.
He's awesome.
She's a venture capitalist and former utility commissioner. So seeing as she's in Hawaii, I'd like to emphasize that her session won't be at our normal 11:30 p.m. Central Time. It'll be at 2:30 to 3.